Willow Creek, a quiet town in the heart of America's Bible Belt, had always prided itself on its unwavering faith and traditional values. At the center of this tightly knit community stood the Mathers family, led by Pastor David Mathers, a man whose sermons inspired devotion and trust. For years, his daughter, Grace Mathers, had been considered the town's golden child. Grace, 22, was everything the community expected of a pastor's daughter. She led the church choir with a voice that could bring tears to even the hardest hearts. At charity drives, she organized food donations with precision, and during Sunday services, her pious demeanor radiated purity. Yet, for all her outward perfection, there were whispers, subtle, quiet murmurs that suggested all might not be as it seemed. She always had this smile, recalls Lisa Freeman, a church volunteer. It was warm, sure, but I don't know. Sometimes it felt like she was hiding something. Behind closed doors, Grace felt the weight of the town's expectations bearing down on her. Every decision was scrutinized, not just by the congregation, but by her father, whose strict moral compass left little room for rebellion. Friends recall that even as a teenager, Grace seemed different, distant almost. She was sweet, but you could tell she wanted something more, says Emma Fields, a childhood friend. That yearning for freedom took Grace down a path no one could have foreseen. In the summer of 2023, while helping out with a church repair project, she met Caleb Reed. Caleb Reed's arrival in Willow Creek was unremarkable at first. He took on handyman jobs, moving between small towns with little fanfare. In Willow Creek, he was hired to repair a section of the church fence. "We didn't know much about him," says Sheriff Harold Thompson. "He kept to himself, but folks noticed he had a past. You could see it in the tattoos and the way he talked. He wasn't from here, that's for sure." At 29, Caleb carried the weight of a life spent on the edges of society. A former addict with a string of petty crimes behind him, he was trying to rebuild. Locals remember his quiet demeanor and sharp eyes. "He wasn't unfriendly," says Don Myers, the church groundskeeper. "Just guarded." Grace first noticed Caleb one afternoon while delivering iced tea to the workers. He looked up, and there was this moment, Don recalls. "I saw it, like they recognized something in each other." Soon, their interactions became more frequent. Witnesses reported seeing Grace lingering near the worksite, chatting with Caleb longer than necessary. "It was strange," says Lisa Freeman. Grace wasn't the kind of girl who'd spend time with someone like him. Their conversations grew more personal, with Caleb opening up about his struggles. In Grace, he saw a light, something pure and untouched by the darkness he'd known. For Grace, Caleb represented freedom, a life outside the rigid expectations of Willow Creek. But as their connection deepened, Grace's behavior began to change. Her friends noticed she was distracted, her usual meticulousness faltering. She'd forget things, seemed nervous all the time, Emma Fields recalls. It was like she was carrying a secret. That secret was Caleb, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. By the fall of 2023, Grace and Caleb's relationship had crossed the line from friendship to something far more intimate. The two met in secret, far from the prying eyes of the town. Witnesses later reported seeing them at a diner in a neighboring county, their heads bent close in whispered conversation. "They thought no one would notice," says Sheriff Thompson. But in a town like Willow Creek, secrets don't stay hidden for long. Grace's father began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She skipped a Wednesday prayer meeting, a first for her, and seemed increasingly withdrawn. She wasn't herself, Pastor Mathers told investigators. "I thought maybe she was struggling with her faith." Caleb, too, was changing. Friends and co-workers described him as more volatile, his temper flaring unpredictably. "He seemed on edge," says Don Myers, like he was waiting for something to blow up. Their clandestine romance came to a head when Caleb confronted Grace about their future. According to messages recovered from Caleb's phone, he had grown tired of hiding. In one text, he wrote, "I'm not a secret, Grace. If you love me, prove it." Grace, torn between her feelings for Caleb and her fear of her father's reaction, begged for more time. But Caleb wasn't willing to wait. In a heated exchange days before his death, he issued an ultimatum. Either Grace told her father the truth, or he would. That's when everything changed, says Sheriff Thompson. Whatever happened next, it set them on a path of no return. By late November 2023, Grace Mathers was living a waking nightmare. Caleb's ultimatum loomed over her like a storm cloud, and her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Church members noticed her growing detachment during services. Friends described her as anxious and distracted. Even her father, usually preoccupied with his pastoral duties, began to voice concerns about her unusual behavior. She seemed lost, Pastor David Mathers later told investigators. I'd ask her if something was wrong, and she'd just smile and say everything was fine. But I could tell something was weighing on her. Caleb, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly frustrated. Messages recovered from his phone showed a pattern of escalating tension. I'm tired of being a secret, one message read. Another, sent just days before his death, said, if you can't stand up for us, maybe there's nothing to stand up for. The two met one final time at the old quarry on the outskirts of town, a secluded spot they had often used for their secret rendezvous. Witnesses later reported seeing Grace's car parked near the quarry that night, though no one saw Caleb arrive. The confrontation was heated. Caleb reiterated his ultimatum, accusing Grace of being ashamed of him. Grace, in turn, pleaded for more time, insisting she wasn't ready to tell her father. But Caleb had reached his breaking point. He turned to leave, vowing to expose their relationship himself. What happened next would change both their lives forever. In a moment of blind panic, Grace picked up a heavy rock and struck Caleb from behind. He collapsed instantly, the sound of his body hitting the ground echoing in the still night. Grace froze, staring in horror at what she had done. According to her later confession, she acted out of desperation, fearing Caleb's threats would ruin her life. I didn't mean to hurt him, she sobbed during her police interview. I just wanted to stop him. The discovery of Caleb Reed's body was as sudden as it was shocking. On the morning of December 2nd, 2023, a local hiker stumbled upon the scene while walking near the quarry. Caleb's body lay partially concealed beneath a pile of loose dirt and rocks, his injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. The sheriff's office was called immediately. It was clear this wasn't an accident, Sheriff Harold Thompson said. The way the body was concealed, it was intentional. The investigation began in earnest, with authorities combing the area for clues. Caleb's truck, parked nearby, contained personal items, including his phone, which proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. Messages between Caleb and Grace painted a vivid picture of their tumultuous relationship. Those texts were crucial, says lead investigator Clara Jenkins. They established a timeline and motive. It was clear Caleb was pressuring Grace, and she was struggling to keep things hidden. As news of Caleb's death spread through Willow Creek, the town was plunged into shock. Few people knew much about him, but the rumors surrounding his relationship with Grace quickly became the talk of the town. Grace, meanwhile, maintained her routine, attending church services and choir rehearsals as if nothing had happened. But her composure began to falter as the investigation progressed. Friends noticed she seemed on edge, avoiding conversations about Caleb's death. She looked like she was carrying the weight of the world, Emma Fields recalled. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis linked footprints at the quarry to Grace's shoes, and her car was spotted on traffic cameras leaving the area on the night of Caleb's death. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Grace was brought in for questioning. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Willow Creek Police Department, Grace Mathers sat across from detectives, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of untouched coffee. For hours, she denied any involvement in Caleb's death, insisting she hadn't seen him in weeks. But as investigators presented the evidence, footprints, text messages, and eyewitness accounts, her resolve began to crack. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Grace broke down. Between sobs, she recounted the events of that fateful night, describing the fear and desperation that had driven her to act. He said he was going to tell everyone, she whispered. I couldn't let that happen. Grace's confession sent shockwaves through the community. For years, she had been the shining star of Willow Creek, a symbol of faith and virtue. Now, she was at the center of a murder investigation. Pastor David Mathers was devastated by the revelation. In a statement to the press, he expressed his grief and disbelief. "My daughter is a good person," he said. "She made a terrible mistake, but I believe in forgiveness and redemption." Grace was charged with second-degree murder and held without bail. As the town grappled with the scandal, opinions were sharply divided. Some saw Grace as a victim of circumstance, pushed to the brink by Caleb's threats. Others viewed her as a cold-blooded killer who had tarnished her family's reputation and betrayed their faith. Willow Creek was a town that thrived on tradition and moral certainty, but Grace Mather's arrest shattered that veneer. The daughter of the community's most respected pastor, now accused of murder, became the subject of relentless speculation. Neighbors whispered about Caleb Reed and his troubled past, with some blaming Grace for associating with him and others criticizing the pastor for failing to notice the signs. "It was shocking, but in a way, it made sense," said Lisa Freeman, a church volunteer. "She always seemed so perfect, too perfect. Maybe that kind of pressure just builds up." The Mathers family became pariahs almost overnight. Pastor Mathers, previously the pillar of Willow Creek, found himself delivering sermons to dwindling congregations as church members quietly distanced themselves from the scandal. "The hypocrisy was astounding," said Emma Fields, Grace's childhood friend. The same people who praised her for years were now the first to judge her. The media descended on Willow Creek, turning the once quiet town into a hub of activity. Reporters camped outside the church and courthouse, eager for any new details about the case. Headlines ranged from sympathetic, "Tragedy in the Bible Belt," "How Faith Failed Grace Mathers," to damning, "Preacher's Daughter Turned Killer," "The Fall of an Angel." Grace's defense team, led by public defender Diane Miller, faced an uphill battle. "The evidence against her was strong," Miller admitted. But this wasn't just about the crime, it was about the circumstances that led to it. Grace wasn't a monster. She was a young woman who made a terrible choice under immense pressure. As the trial date approached, Willow Creek braced for what would become the most sensational legal battle in its history. On March 12, 2024, the trial of Grace Mathers began in the county courthouse, drawing crowds from Willow Creek and beyond. The prosecution painted a picture of cold-blooded murder, arguing that Grace had killed Caleb Reed to protect her reputation and family standing. "This was not an act of desperation," said prosecutor Carla Ramirez in her opening statement. "This was a calculated decision to silence someone who threatened her perfect image." The defense, however, framed Grace as a victim, both of Caleb's manipulation and of the crushing expectations placed upon her by her father and community. "Grace Mathers is not a killer," Diane Miller argued. "She is a young woman who made a tragic mistake after being pushed to the brink by fear and pressure." Key evidence was presented, including Grace's text messages with Caleb, traffic camera footage of her car near the quarry, and the rock identified as the murder weapon. Forensic experts testified about the injuries Caleb sustained, emphasizing the force of the blows. Grace herself took the stand, her testimony becoming the trial's most emotional moment. Tearfully, she recounted her relationship with Caleb, her fear of losing everything, and the events of that fateful night. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to stop him." Her father sat silently in the courtroom, his head bowed as his daughter spoke. Pastor Mathers later told reporters, "Hearing her testify was the hardest moment of my life, but I still believe in her goodness. She's my daughter." The jury deliberated for 3 days, the weight of the community's judgment resting heavily on their decision. On March 26, 2024, the courtroom was packed as the jury returned with its verdict. Grace Mathers was found guilty of manslaughter, a charge that carried a lesser sentence than second-degree murder but still reflected the gravity of her actions. The judge sentenced Grace to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. In his closing remarks, he acknowledged the complexity of the case. "This is a tragedy on many levels," he said. "But justice must be served." Reactions to the verdict were mixed. Some in the community felt the sentence was too lenient, given Caleb's death. Others believed it was too harsh, citing Grace's lack of criminal history and the extenuating circumstances. Outside the courthouse, Grace's father gave a brief statement to the press. "Today, my family begins a journey of healing. I ask for your prayers, not just for Grace, but for Caleb's family as well. We are all victims of this tragedy. Caleb's mother, Gloria Reed, expressed her disappointment in the verdict. "My son didn't deserve to die," she said tearfully. "And she gets to walk free in a few years? That's not justice." Grace Mathers began her prison sentence at a state correctional facility, where she enrolled in counseling and educational programs. According to prison officials, she expressed deep remorse for her actions and worked to rebuild her sense of self outside the shadow of her father's expectations. Pastor Mathers continued to lead his dwindling congregation, using his sermons to address themes of forgiveness and redemption. "We cannot change the past," he preached one Sunday, "but we can choose how we move forward." Willow Creek struggled to move past the scandal. The church lost members, and the Mathers name became a reminder of the town's darkest chapter. But for some, the tragedy served as a wake-up call about the dangers of perfectionism and the pressures placed on young women in faith-based communities. Grace's story became the subject of documentaries and true crime podcasts, sparking debates about morality, justice, and the human capacity for redemption. A year after her sentencing, she penned a letter to Caleb's family, apologizing for her actions and expressing her grief over his death. Though the letter went unanswered, those close to Grace said it was a step toward healing. As for Caleb, his memory lived on through those who loved him. "He wasn't perfect," his mother said at a memorial service, "but he deserved better than what happened to him. I hope we can all learn from this and honor his life by treating each other with compassion." In the end, the pastor's daughter's deadly secret became more than a story of crime. It was a tale of broken lives, shattered expectations, and the slow, painful road to redemption. Thank you for watching this shocking tale of love, betrayal, and tragedy. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping true crime documentaries. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the latest twists in the most chilling real-life stories. Share your thoughts on Grace's journey. Was she a victim of circumstance, or did she cross the line? Join the conversation below and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the world's darkest secrets.